Hello, I am Brian Bowen, and welcome to Apologetics 101. We're here today doing an interview with Dr. Denny Faulkner of Answers in Genesis, who's an astronomer, and we're going to be talking about the rakia, the expanse of Genesis 1. We're going to touch on things like geocentrism versus heliocentrism, cosmological models in ancient times, and things of that nature. Whether the Bible believers believed in a flat Earth, things like that, and as well as talking about the expanse, the waters above the expanse. We're going to be discussing all that, and we're going to be starting right now. All right, we're here with Dr. Denny Faulkner. Do you want to introduce yourself, Dr. Faulkner?
Yes, I'm the astronomer here at Answers in Genesis. I'm on the research in the research department here. I've been here for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a professor at University of South Carolina, Lancaster for more than a quarter century. I had an opportunity a decade ago to retire a little early. And so here I am. I study eclipsing binary stars and other things in my professional research, but I've written quite a bit and speak quite a bit about creation relating to astronomy.
Awesome. Okay, today we are talking about the expanse in Genesis 1. Just to kind of give some clarification, Dr. Faulkner, we're doing a commentary series on Genesis 1 through 11. So essentially, I go through the text of Genesis, or whatever chapter I'm on, in this case, chapter 1, and then I go back and do a lot of topological stuff. This is actually the last video in chapter 1 of Genesis that we're doing, and then we'll be moving on to chapter 2. But today we are going to be talking about the expanse in Genesis 1. You have written on this topic matter before, and it touches on a little bit about cosmological models, and some people have some ideas about how they think the biblical cosmological understanding was, and so we'll probably go into that a little bit more. Um, Essentially, the question before us is does the Bible teach that that God created like a solid dome around the earth? I think this is going to center around the proper translation of rakia, and probably the reason why some people think this is talking about a solid dome as well. You can go ahead, Dr. Partner.
Okay, there's a long story on this one. The word rakia is the Hebrew word used. It first appears in verse 6 of Genesis 1, the beginning of the day 2 account, where God said, let there be this rakia, or expanse, or firmament, that amidst the waters, divide the waters above and below. I must confess, I first encountered this more than a half century ago in high school, trying to figure out what this meant. And resources were much more meager back then than we are today, but there's a lot less disinformation out there, I'm afraid. And let me trace the story of this pretty quickly. The Septuagint was the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. It was done in the 2nd or 3rd century BC in Alexandria. It was a Greek city founded by Alexander the Great in North Africa, in Egypt. And it became very quickly a center of culture and learning. For a few hundred years, it was the place to go in the Mediterranean world, the ancient world that we draw our Western civilization from. The Great Library was there. It was a tremendous place. And there were a lot of, from the diaspora, there were a lot of Jews were living there. And because of the diaspora, many Jews were no longer able to read the scriptures because they didn't read Hebrew anymore. They were reading whatever. Greek was the international language. So they saw a need to translate the word, the Bible, into the common language of the people. And when they got to this thing on day 2, you look at it in day 4, it speaks of that's where God put the luminaries, the star, the sun, the moon, the planets, and so forth, in on day 4. Now, at the time, the ancient Greek cosmology looked a bit like this. You had a Earth at the center, that spherical Earth showing up there, and then you've got this crystalline sphere around it. This is made out of plastic, but they thought it was maybe glass or quartz or something. And the stars were attached. You look carefully, you can see those little stars there. And the Greeks would describe this as a stereoma, which is a hard thing. And in the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul wrote "stand firm" in the gospel, he used the word stereoma there. And so they use that word. And I honestly think what they were doing is they were saying, aha, science now, this is 2,200 years ago, science has told us how the world works. And so they thought they were making a good translation. They were making a good translation of the science of the day, but they weren't doing a terrible job because of translating the Hebrew, because the word raqia actually means expanse. It means something that's stretched out or spread out. It can be a two-dimensional, three-dimensional. It's not clear at all. And later on, that was Greek became less and less used in the western part of the Roman Empire. So around the 4th century, I believe, or 5th century, Jerome translated the Old and now the New Testament into Latin, which was the common language in the western end of the empire. We call this the Vulgate, and this was now the Bible for the next 1,000 years. And Jerome, I understand, not only knew Greek and Hebrew, but he also knew Latin, of course. And so he worked from his original sources, worked from what sources he had, and translated the Bible that way. When he got to this word there, instead of translating it as expanse, though, he chose to translate it as firmamentum, which is a Latin word referring to something hard or firm. So if you want to translate stereoma, that was a fantastic word to use. But if you wanted to translate it properly, you would have used some other Latin word. And then we go almost 800 years past that, almost 1,000 years later, about 700 years ago. And John Wycliffe was the first person to translate much of the Bible into English. It was an earlier form of English, of course, difficult for us to read today, but it was the first attempt. He didn't know Latin. He didn't know Greek. He didn't know Hebrew. He did know Latin. He didn't have manuscripts anyway in Greek or Hebrew, manuscripts of the Bible. So he worked from the Vulgate. And so when he got to this firmamentum, he simply transliterated it into English to create a new word. Whenever you find in the Old Testament, particularly a word that's transliterated into English rather than translated, that's a clue that the translators didn't know how to translate it. They just didn't know what to do with it. And keep in mind, this cosmology from the ancient Greeks was very much in play in Jerome's time and also in Wycliffe's time. That was what everybody thought the world was like, and did so until about 400 years ago, when suddenly the cosmology changed. And so when later people like the King James and the Bishop Bible and the Geneva Bible translated, you don't translate in the vacuum, you see what other people have done. And so they followed Wycliffe's lead and all that. That's the reason why the King James and the Geneva Bible say firmament again. However, it's interesting, in the Geneva Bible, which predates the King James by a half century, there was a footnote or a endnote or side note that said or expanse. So they knew what it meant, but they didn't want to stray too far from earlier translations. And I think the first editions of the King James did the same thing. They put or expanse. So they were trying their best to kind of insert that true meaning back in without actually doing it, I'm afraid. And you really didn't start seeing expanse explicitly put into translations until the late 19th century. I'm pretty sure that Young in his literal translation did that. And of course, the NASB and others, the ESV and others do expanse. And many of the reformers knew what it meant. According to his commentary, John Calvin knew, Martin Luther knew. They both understood the meaning of this. So when people try to say, well, that's just a new idea, no, the idea goes back 400 and 500 years and probably much, much earlier on what it means. I've asked some Hebrew speakers, some people who are not even Christian, don't even practice Judaism very carefully. I asked them, what does rakia mean in Hebrew? And they tell me the sky, the expanse. They tell me things. They never tell me it's a dome or it's a thing like that over top of us. So that's the real story of how this all came about. In the late 19th century, there arose the conflict thesis, the idea that everybody thought the world was flat. They thought there was a dome over top, all this kind of nonsense. It's not true. The church never taught that. There were skeptics that were trying to say that the Bible was wrong about some fundamental things. And at the time, reasonably conservative Bible scholars didn't bite. They simply refused to accept it and went on. It was about 30 years ago that this idea of a dome sitting over a flat Earth began making its appearance in otherwise conservative circles. And one of the people I hold most responsible for this is Michael Heiser. He died just a few weeks ago. Michael Heiser has been for years been saying that he would put up this diagram of a flat Earth with a dome over top. One of the people I hold most responsible for this is the late Michael Heiser. He died just a few weeks ago, and he's been going around for years saying that the cosmology of the Bible is this flat disk with a dome over top. He said this is the cosmology of the Bible. This is the cosmology that Genesis 1 teaches. Now, I think Michael Heiser was very confused in this matter. I believe he believed in the inspiration and authority of Scripture, yet he's saying to and that's very bad. John Walton has joined in, and Paul Seeley has also taught this.
All right. Now, you mentioned Michael Heiser on the flat disk. I actually debated somebody recently over that very issue. I just got through doing debate with him over that. He started talking to me about how he thinks that everybody was geocentric and that the Bible taught geocentrism and a flat Earth and the ancient Near East taught this. What would you say to that question about like, say, for example, some people will try to bring this up, like they'll claim that the ancient Near East taught a flat disk with a circle around it or a dome around it. My understanding is there's actually no actual evidence that the ancient Near East taught this, but what do you think?
Well, it's become very fashionable to claim that the ancient Near Eastern cosmology was a flat disk Earth with a dome over top. And that was a cosmology found in the ancient Near East, but as it turns out, there are many different cosmologies. It was 150 years ago, dug that one up and became the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, but there are many, many others. A problem you have there is the church never adopted that. That's just a lie that was created in the 19th century to discredit the Bible and the church. And unfortunately, flat earthers have uncritically accepted that lie rather than challenging it. It's true that the Roman Catholic Church and even early reformers opposed the heliocentric geocentrism, a spherical earth, but it was the earth that was the center of the universe. And some of the early reformers also opposed the heliocentric model as it began to be taught in the 1500s. But by the 1600s, Protestants had come to terms with the heliocentric model and the Roman Catholic Church a bit later. So it's true that many people in the church thought the world was geocentric, but it's not true that there are a couple of people you can find in church history way back who were not really very important at all, who thought the world was flat, but that was a very small minority opinion. So again, people who want to teach that that's what the Bible teaches and what Christians have always thought, they're just simply got a false history they're dealing with.
Right. Would you, it's my understanding that, and I'll repeat this as well, that the Bible actually doesn't say anything on geocentrism or heliocentrism, but there are certain passages, though, that some people say, oh, well, that is used to teach geocentrism. One of them is like Psalm 93, I think, and another one's from Psalm 104 about Earth not being able to be moved. What would you say to that when people bring up those kinds of verses?
Yeah, I believe the cosmology of the Bible is rather vague. It could be interpreted as geocentric, interpreted as heliocentric, and so forth. The Bible is pretty silent about it, and people have chosen to interpret certain passages and then imprinted that meaning onto the scripture, which is eisegesis rather than exegesis, exegetical approach to doing scripture. The idea that some of the verses in the poetic books talking about says the earth shall not be moved, they don't realize that the prophet, David himself said, I shall not be moved, using the exact same language, exact same verb. So if you're going to appeal to that to prove the geocentric model, then you have
You
At
there?
some point, you have to appeal to the David-centric theory that David sat down and never moved again. So if you look at the scriptures very carefully and compare them, you finally start finding these ideas about geocentrism really are overwrought. Again, the Bible's cosmology is rather vague, and I think that's a good thing.
Oh, okay. What about the Israelites? Do you think that the Israelites believed in, because some people say that the Israelites believed in a flat earth with a dome around it. Would you say that there's no evidence at all that the Israelites actually believed that about cosmology?
We don't know what kind of cosmology the ancient Hebrews believed. They just didn't think that was important. You don't find cosmological writings until really the late Middle Ages. Some of that coming out of the Iberian Peninsula. The one book that people like to point to is First Enoch, which is a non-canonical book. I've tried reading it, and it seems to have that sort of dome cosmology, but it's not clear. And by the way, the cosmology he teaches is very different from the cosmology that modern flat earthers embrace. They want to say, well, he was a flat earther with a dome over top. Yes, but look at his model; it doesn't match your model at all. But First Enoch is not inspired scripture. Simple as that. They want to make it that, but it's not. The idea that the Hebrews believed in a flat domed earth is coming back to what's called the documentary hypothesis that the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, for instance, was written about 1,000 years later. They would say that the Pentateuch was written during or shortly after the captivity. And so they would say the creation account, the flood account, and even the cosmology of the first two chapters of Genesis was picked up while they were in the captivity. And so it reflected the cosmology of Babylon. Well, the problem with that is it's a direct assault upon the inspiration authority of Scripture. You're saying it's just the collection of ideas and fables that the ancient Hebrews put together.
Right. I read something the other day that the Babylonians actually no evidence the Babylonians actually believed in a flat dome earth like that.
Well, there were some Babylonian cosmologies that taught that, but again, there were different Babylonian cosmologies. The first people we have a clear record of teaching a globe Earth really are the Greeks, and they were shortly after the Babylonians, about the time of the Persians or shortly thereafter the Persians. But it doesn't mean that people before that didn't believe in a spherical Earth. It just simply means that's the earliest. I'm not saying that the first mention by the ancient Greeks going back to 400 or 500 BC is the first 5th or 6th century BC, and that's among the Greeks. But that doesn't mean that the Greeks were the first to actually believe the Earth is spherical. Just the earliest record we have of a globe Earth goes back to the ancient Greeks, 4th, 5th, 6th century BC. So they were believing it that far back, but that doesn't mean they were the first people to believe in a globe Earth. The belief could have gone much earlier than that. It's just simply that's the first record we have of that sort of teaching.
Right. They've actually believed the world was around for thousands of years.
Probably.
Christopher Columbus didn't discover that.
No, he did not. That's part of our what I call the Columbus mythology. It fits very nicely with the conflict thesis. But flat earthers who want to repeat that, they are repeating the devil's lie when they do that. They're taking a false history, and they really need to look at the true history of all this. I highly recommend in Jeffrey Burton Russell's book, Inventing the Flat Earth, Columbus and Modern Historians. It was written over 30 years ago, but it's a very good book. He's a medieval scholar and does a fantastic job of explaining the whole history of this flat Earth myth.
All right. I want to ask you about the canopy theory, because some Christians do hold to the canopy theory. Now, my understanding is that this view has been largely abandoned by most young Earth Christians today. I know Answers in Genesis no longer holds to it, but there are some Christians still around that probably does hold to it. And the idea is that that God put a canopy around the earth, and then at the time of the flood, this canopy came down. Now, originally they said water canopy, then later they said a possible ice canopy.
Vapor canopy.
Yeah, well, the original was vapor canopy. With I think Ken Hovind holds to like an ice canopy around the earth and that sort of thing. What would you say? What are the biblical and scientific reasons why you think that a lot of younger Christians have abandoned the canopy theory and why that model does not really work with the text very well?
Yeah, a half century ago, the canopy theory was widely believed, but we've gotten away from that. Most of the creation ministries don't support it. Creation scientists don't. It's lay people, for the most part, have not gotten the message on this one. But there's some problems. I think physically it doesn't work. I think the biblical approach is very questionable. The description of the day 4 account and the day 5 account doesn't fit well with the canopy. You have the birds flying in the face of the canopy, or the face of the expanse, not the but if the canopy model is correct, then they were flying in this expanse, and the stars just appear to be, and that's got completely backwards from the day 4 and day 5 account, what it actually says. Also, one of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 148, I believe, mentions the waters above the heavens. And if it collapsed at the time of the flood, what were they doing there after the flood when the psalmist wrote about them? So there are a host of problems, and we tried to stamp it out. It's been an official position of Answers in Genesis from the get-go that we don't believe in the canopy model anymore. But there are many, many people out there who still haven't heard.
Right. My understanding is there are also some scientific issues involved with that, like the heat and so forth, generating too much heat.
Yeah, there are problems with if you have that vapor canopy or water canopy, you retain heat, making it very hot on the earth. Additional pressure problems. How do you keep the water up there? A host of problems. Larry Vardaman at Institute for Creation Research back in the 90s worked very, very diligently to try to get a canopy model that would work, and he never could. It is not physically viable at all, I don't think.
All right. On the Hebrew word rakia, that the Hebrew word that I think most Bible translations do translate it now as expanse. Some still translate it as dome or canopy or firmament. But most usually translate it as expanse now. Especially a lot of the literal translations. This word rakia, it is supposed to be talking about something that is being stretched out. Is that correct?
Yes, something that's been expanded, stamped out, spread out. It's interesting you mentioned the different translations. The NIV came out 40 years ago, and it had expanse, but then a decade ago they went with vault. And this is in response to that increasing story out there that it refers to something hard and solid. And again, that's something that's happened the last 30 years. So I've lost a lot of confidence in NIV when that happened a decade ago.
Okay. I heard that the verb form of rakia was raka, basically meaning to stretch something out. And of course, you see lots of passages in the Old Testament that talks about the expanse being stretched out.
Yeah, 11 times in the Old Testament, it speaks of the heavens being stretched, but the word raqia is not used there. Raqia is the verb from which the noun rakia comes. The word raqia refers to stamping something out. So it can refer to stomping your foot. If you stomp your foot, you're rakiaing. If you take a hammer and pound on a metal, you're rakia. Now, when you do that, if you pound on a metal like gold particularly, but also bronze or steel of iron can do that, you tend to stretch it out and make it thinner. I've done a little metalworking in high school shop class, and I pounded on metal to make it thinner and spread it out like that. Unfortunately, many people say, well, you got to look at the substance being spread out. It's hard metal. It's a metal, and metals are hard. Well, I got news for you. Gold is not hard. It's pretty soft. And whenever you make a noun out of a verb, it's always some property or some part of the action of that verb. It never is a property of the object of that action. And I like to use the word expanse and expand. The word expand is a verb that came from the French into the English, and it started off as expand. And then when you expand something, it becomes an expanse. So it works beautifully. It's a great analogy because it's the exact same sort of word we're getting at here. And it would be like saying that what's expanded? Well, a balloon can be expanded. Well, therefore, the expanse must be made out of rubber. that's about what you're talking about, or something flexible. That's the sort of thing that people are doing when they say this has to be a hard substance like a metal, because they're totally missing the point of how you create words. It's the action of the verb, not any properties of the object of the verb might have.
So you would say there's nothing inherently about rakia that would require it to be something solid.
No, it could be, but it could be anything else. It's something that's expanded or spread out. That's the whole point.
Right. On the waters above, you've written on this topic matter on that. Well, before I get into that, let me qualify what you think the expanse is. Do you think the expanse is referring to the universe, the atmosphere? Exactly what exactly is it that you think the Bible is referring to as the expanse?
Well, it says in verse 8 of Genesis 1 that God called the expanse heaven. Shemayim is a Hebrew word, and the word Shemayim refers to things above us, everything above us. And so I believe that expanse is referring to things that we see above us. It refers to the atmosphere, refers to the atmospheric, the space of where the heavenly bodies are. So, yeah, it's everything above us.
Right. The literal translation, Shamayim, it would be like sky or heaven.
Yeah.
Or it could be heavens. It's in dual form, so it could be either single or plural, depending on context. So you would say that they're using kind of observational language. Like today, we would look up at the night sky and say night sky, even though we know we're looking up at space, essentially. So they're just kind of using this observational language to describe it.
In a few minutes, I'm going to go outside. I'm going to look at clouds up in the sky, and I'm going to see the sun up in the sky. And I'm not contradicting myself, even though I know the clouds are a lot closer to me than the sun is. They're both above me. They're in the sky. They're in the heavens. They're in the Shemayim. They're in the Rakia.
Right. So, in other words, it's perfectly legitimate to describe them from an observational standpoint, but at the same time, technically, there's some distinctions there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Now, the waters above, this one's a little bit more trickier because people tend to think, okay, how could the waters above be above, the universe? Or I think so. I know Dr. Lyles held to the position that he thinks that the waters above is the clouds. I've had him on my channel many times. He's a very, very good scientist. But any given case, but I do know that Answers in Genesis holds the position what most young Earth Christians, and Dr. Lyle does admit his view is minority, because he says that I think the majority position is that the water above is above the universe itself. Exactly. How exactly would you picture this? And is that your view that the water?
Yeah. Yes. I had a very big revolution in my cosmology about 10 years ago. I used to subscribe to something a bit different, but now I believe that if the rakia separating the waters above and below is space and the atmosphere, then there must be water at the edge of the universe, beyond the universe, as it were. And once I recognized that, then I realized that stuff must radiate. And if it's because it is matter, and matter always radiates, and so there should be a uniform radiation field at low temperature coming from every direction in space, which is what we see. It's called the cosmic microwave background, of the CMB, and that was discovered in 1964. It's taken as evidence or proof of the Big Bang. I used to give talks, I still do, about the Big Bang, and I talk about the CMB.
Yeah.
So people would ask me when I gave these talks about the Big Bang and cosmology, they said, well, if the CMB is not coming from the Big Bang, what's it coming from? And I didn't know for many years, but my answer now is it's coming from the waters at the edge of creation. So I view that as evidence. When we see the CMB, we're seeing evidence of day 2 creation.
All right. The waters above, this is the one thing I'm trying to best understand. Would you see this like a shell around universe? That means even space. Space, stars, all the celestial bodies go all the way up to the edge of the universe. Of course, now in secular cosmologies, they don't actually view the universe as having an edge or even a center. but we would say that the universe has a center and that there is an edge to it. And you're saying that beyond that is this shell of water that God has put there.
Yeah, when I developed this cosmology a decade ago, it really rocked my world because several things. It says, number one, there's an edge to the universe, and that's anathema to modern cosmology. Number two, we're probably somewhere close to the center, which they wouldn't like that either. And number three, there's water at the edge of the universe, and like a shell sitting around us. Far out, here's the shell way out here, and we're somewhere into the middle. And again, that really rocked my world. And it's not the sort of thing that many astronomers or cosmologists would like very much, but I think that's what Scripture's teaching.
Awesome. All right. And before we leave this part, would you say that the Hebrew word, I believe it's mahim, the Hebrew word for water or
Yeah,
water?
mayim is the Hebrew word for water, and shemayim is the Hebrew word for heavens. And some people try to argue that the word mayim comes from, or shemayim comes from mayim, but I don't accept that at all. I talk to Hebraists, and they tell me they're not related at all.
No, what I was going to ask though is the mayim would be referring to liquid water, so you would not see this as a gas
Yeah,
or solid form or anything like that, because it would use other Hebrew words like a Hebrew word for or cloud or
yeah,
something of that nature, but it
yeah.
would use it
Yeah,
would use,
there are Hebrew words for ice. There are Hebrew words for vapor, and it's not used there. The word is mayim. And let's face it, when I say water, do you think ice or steam? Well, no, you think of liquid H2O. And so I think the word mayim doesn't refer to ice, doesn't refer to steam. It refers to liquid H2O, what we call water. And so I do believe that water at the edge of the universe is in a liquid form. And some have asked me, well, what about the conditions out there? Wouldn't it cause it to be gas or ice? And I say, well, no, we're talking about the physical conditions at the edge of the universe. Do you understand what that means? Because I certainly don't. So I think it's liquid water.
awesome. All right. Uh, on you wrote on that the Jewish cosmology being the like the three heavens or the biblical cosmology in reference to or three heavens. Could you explain that? I know that the Bible does talk about the like the third heavens, where God dwells. Um,
Yeah,
how, how,
the idea of three heavens is something that's kind of hinted at in Scripture. The only time it's mentioned is the Apostle Paul in the New Testament mentions himself being caught up to the third heaven. That's the abode of God. But this three-tiered heaven is not clearly taught in Scripture. It is a common ancient concept, and even today we use it. We recognize we've got this lower heaven or first heaven where the birds are, the clouds are, and rain and so forth would be. The second heaven would be the astronomical realm, and in the third heaven, the heavenly realm. So it's hinted at in Scripture, but not clearly taught. So you need to be careful about that. But the third heaven is definitely mentioned, which kind of implies the other two as well.
all right. Um, well, um, so you would say that the Bible, Genesis 1, teaches the expanse. It teaches that the Hebrew word rakia is better translated as something that's being stretched out, something that's malleable. Um, there's nothing inherent into the word that would make you think it's has to be talking about something. It could be, but there's nothing about the word itself that makes you think it's talking about something solid. So it could be either one. So that therefore the context is what supplies the extra meaning where you understand what it's talking about. And
Yes, context is always important. There's nothing inherently about rakia that suggests it has to be solid. It could be, but context does not dictate what it is. It's just something that's been expanded. It's up to us to try to figure that one out.
right. And the uh the text tells us that equates the Shamahim with that of the Rakia, which is literally means sky or heaven or heavens.
Yep.
And so that's what we should take out of that. There's nothing about the views that people usually have, like with flat Earth, dome, and stuff like that. It's
No,
mostly in their minds.
yeah, the Bible does not teach the earth is flat. The Bible does not teach the earth has a dome over top. That's just when flat earthers make that claim, they're just simply wrong.
Right. Awesome. All right. I think we reached the end of our discussion. All right, no problem. Thank you for joining me on here, and I will talk to you later. And again, thank you, Dr. Faulkner.
Oh, my pleasure. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. Thank you again for joining me on Apologetics 101. This was a very interesting discussion. I learned a lot. It just fascinates me, this kind of thing. This will be the last video in chapter 1 of our commentary series on Genesis, in the Genesis series. From here, we're going to be moving on to chapter 2 of the book of Genesis. It is so awesome because chapter 2 is when I'm going to be discussing a lot of, we're going to have some non-evolutionary videos as well, but we're going to be discussing a lot of videos on creation versus evolution, and things like the fossil record, things like that. And just because we're leaving chapter 1 don't mean we'll never refer back to chapter 1. There's going to be times when we do refer back to chapter 1 or allude to it or reference it, etc. So just because we're leaving chapter 1 don't mean it's completely out of our minds, but we've exhausted all the video topics we can possibly do with chapter 1, and so we're going to move on to chapter 2 of Genesis, where I plan on doing a lot of creation versus evolution discussions, and don't miss that at all. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please get subscribed. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so that way you can be alerted with all future videos. That's very important, so that way YouTube can alert you of it. Don't forget to like the videos. That help with the YouTube algorithm and getting this information out there. And so without further ado, anyway, thank you again for joining me on this channel. I thought Dr. Faulkner did an awesome job, and I can't wait. I have been itching to start chapter 2 of Genesis in this commentary series, and now we've started it. And we're going to be doing a lot of videos on the fossil record. We're not just going to touch on the fossil record on one video and then that's it. That's the last time we ever talk about it. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different things, including I plan on trying to invite biologists on here, geneticists, fossil experts, anyone I can get a hold of, pretty much. I plan on getting them on this channel, and it's going to be so awesome. Paleontologists, things like that. So it's going to be cool. So join us in for that discussion. And I am Brian Bowen from Apologetics 101, signing off.